Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to General Breedlove, you spoke earlier about Ukraine, and let me just say that when you were Supreme Allied Commander, you had the courage to stand for providing the Ukrainians the lethal weapons that they needed to defend themselves. And as you say, I won't say defensive because they can also be used offensively, but one reason I think we have the situation we're seeing on the eastern border of Ukraine today, which is dire, the ambassador wants to come see me today about it, is because we didn't act. But you stood up, and you're not just saying it now after the fact, and you did so privately and publicly, and I appreciate that. I think NATO needs to be described better, too. I mean, do you think countries in NATO ought to contribute more to the defense of, the mutual defense of all of us?
Senator, thank you for that question, and I get asked this a lot. And so let me just let me get quickly through. I do believe that the nations of NATO need to contribute more. Okay,
I don't want to interrupt you, but I have a lot of questions, so I just want to get that on the record. I think they do need to contribute more and a better percentage of their GDP, and I think we shouldn't hesitate to ask for that and even insist on that. Second, I think there's a misunderstanding about the importance of NATO. I think the interoperability we have with these NATO forces is a force multiplier in ways that perhaps we don't explain. Can you briefly talk about that from a military point of view?
Absolutely, Senator, and then I would like 2 minutes to go back to that first one.
We may not get that 2 minutes. I got more interesting ones for you.
Clearly, the interoperability of our NATO allies and some of our partners who are not allies is very important because it allows us to quickly assimilate the combat power we might need in a tough place. That having been said, we all, including our military, and certainly the militaries of Europe, need to look at our readiness and responsiveness in order to be able to respond. But maintaining that, that ability to rapidly integrate and work together is clearly a huge deterrent.
Interconnected communications, logistical interconnectedness, the ability for us to have common tactics and doctrines, invaluable, right? And that helps us to be able to, again, to tell our taxpayers and our citizens this is a good investment for our military. Let's talk about Russia for a moment. There's a lot of discussion about the possibility of aligning with Russia to fight ISIS. All of us want to take down ISIS, as you said earlier. But with regard to that interoperability, can you talk a little about what we have with Russia? How effective would a joint military campaign be with Russia, as an example? Even in Syria, should we have the same interests, which, as you noted, we seem not to, but with the broader campaign against ISIS?
Senator, if you would allow me, I'll talk about problems, I think, of the U.S. and Russia fighting alongside of each other. I think that people with more experience in CENTCOM could better speak specifically to the Syria piece of it. Mm-hmm. But what I do know is that, that in observing what has happened in Syria over the past months and years, we do not have the same approach to targeting. We talk about collateral damage. Yes, we still have some collateral damage, but it is minuscule compared to wars of the past. We approach protecting non-belligerent life in a very different way. We have a not adequately deep, but deeper bench of precision weapons, and what we saw is the Russians used precision weapons only for a short time and then went to unguided, fairly indiscriminate weaponry. I don't find that we are well aligned in the way we would conduct a fight, and that would. And
we also don't have the interoperability in terms of weapons and communications and technology. I think it's a point that sometimes is lost in this discussion, and I'm not suggesting that we don't have the ability to work with Russia where we can find common ground, but I think it's clear that we do not have this capability with Russia that we have, for instance, with our NATO allies, and that ought to be considered. You talked about warfare below the line, as you called it. The Russians sometimes call it the new generation war, and Ukraine is a good example of it. I appreciate the fact, Ms. Smith, that you talked about this issue and specifically the connection between the propaganda and the cyber attacks, the troll farms on social media, the funding of useful think tanks, political organizations, state-sponsored media, and so on. One thing I was concerned about, even in how the Obama administration responded to what the Russians are alleged to have done here with our campaign, is that their own executive order was designed to punish cyber attacks and hacking and not these information campaigns. I think it's much broader than that. And I guess my question to you would be, you know, how can we be more effective? We did establish legislation. Senator Murphy and I had put forward this legislation. It was part of the NDAA. It's now set up over a 2-year period, $160 million authorized for this Global Engagement Center to deal with this broader issue of disinformation. Is that, in your view, a good idea? That's to consolidate all the agencies, to make one agency accountable, to actually provide grants for NGOs and others to fight back on the front lines? Should we be doing more? And do you agree with me that these cyber attacks are a huge problem, but that the broader problem is really this broader campaign of disinformation?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge problem, and our large bureaucratic structures are just ill-equipped to deal with this challenge. We're not moving fast enough. We're not really working on detection, deterrence, our defense of these systems. But most importantly, we haven't really figured out to date how to link up with the private sector and utilize expertise that exists above and beyond what the government can offer. And I think if we're going to win this information war and really come at Russia with a much more effective approach, we're going to have to figure out ways in which we can lash up the skill sets that we have in the private sector, build better trust there, to assess our vulnerabilities, and then connect with our allies to do so. So I support the work that you've put forward, the initiatives, legislation, and all the rest. I think we have not served this country well with the efforts to date. We have to be much more quicker on our feet and far more innovative in working with a wider set of actors to really get a grip on this. So I would support that, absolutely.
Thank you both.